You call that a mailbox? It's an eyesore and I'm taking it down. That's what a woman screamed at me before smashing my mailbox to pieces with a sledgehammer, right in broad daylight. No warning, no reason, just pure righteous fury and a homemade T-shirt that said Community Defense Force. She claimed I was breaking HOA rules. The only problem, I never joined a HOA. What started as a bizarre act of vandalism spiral into something much darker and much more absurd. Power trips, fake inspectors, and one very unhinged woman who thought she ran the entire neighborhood. If you've ever had a crazy neighbor or tangled with HOA madness, you're going to want to hear this. Drop your state in the comments and let me know the wildest thing your HOA has ever done. This one, it gets unreal. Let me back up a little. I've been living in this quiet neighborhood for about 6 months. Nice place, decent neighbors, the kind of spot where you can actually hear birds chirping instead of sirens. I bought this house specifically because it was peaceful, no drama, no nonsense, just me and my morning coffee routine on the front porch. I worked from home most days, running my small business, fixing tractors and farm equipment. It's honest work, and it pays the bills. The house came with a decent yard, a white picket fence that needed some paint, and a standard black mailbox that had seen better days. Nothing fancy, nothing that screamed, "Look at me." Just a normal American home in a normal American neighborhood that Saturday morning started like any other. I woke up around 7, made my usual pot of coffee, and settled in my favorite chair on the front porch. The sun was just starting to warm. Everything up, and I was scrolling through my phone, checking messages from customers about their equipment repairs. That's when I heard it bang. The first hit sounded like someone dropping a toolbox. Bang, the second one, made me look up. Bang by the third hit. I was on my feet, coffee mug still in hand, staring at the most ridiculous sight I'd ever seen in my life. There was this woman, maybe late 30s, standing next to my mailbox with a full-sized sledgehammer. She was wearing what looked like a homemade T-shirt with Community Defense Force printed on it in iron-on letters. In her other hand, she held a clipboard that she kept referring to between swings. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she had this determined look on her face like she was performing some kind of sacred duty. The mailbox was already hanging at a weird angle, and papers were scattered all over my lawn. She raised that hammer again and brought it down with a satisfying crack that split the wooden post clean in half. I just stood there for a moment trying to process what I was seeing. This woman was destroying my property in broad daylight, and she seemed to think she had every right to do it. That's when I noticed Mrs. Foster from next door, peeking over the fence with her phone out, recording the whole thing across the street. I could see Mr. Peterson doing the same thing from his kitchen window. This lady had an audience, and she didn't seem to care, if anything. She seemed to be enjoying it. She gave the mailbox one final whack, sending pieces of metal and wood flying in different directions. Then she turned toward my house and saw me standing there with my coffee. Instead of looking embarrassed or apologetic, she marched right up to my porch like she owned the place. "Clayton Dorsey," she said, reading from her clipboard. "You are in violation of multiple homeowners association regulations. This is your final notice." She reached into a folder and pulled out what looked like an official document, though it was slightly crumpled and had coffee stains on it. "You owe $500 for mailbox non-compliance, plus an additional $2,000 in accumulated fines for various violations." I looked at this paper she was waving around, then back at my destroyed mailbox, then back at her. "Ma'am," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "I think there's been some kind of mistake. Who are you exactly?" She puffed up like an angry rooster. and pointed at her homemade shirt. "I am Darla Granger, President of the Meadowbrook Community Defense Force. I am authorized to enforce all HOA regulations in this community. You have 48 hours to pay these fines, or we will proceed with property seizure." Procedures, the whole situation was so absurd that I almost laughed but then I looked at my mailbox again, scattered in pieces across my lawn, and the anger started to build. This woman had just destroyed my property and was demanding money. For the privilege, she dropped the fine notice on my porch and walked away, calling over her shoulder, "48 hours? Mr. Dorsey, the Community Defense Force doesn't make empty threats." I watched her get into a beat-up Honda Civic with a bumper sticker that read, "HOA Enforcement Vehicle" in Comic Sans font. I picked up that soggy fine notice and tried to read through the coffee stains and wrinkles. The reason listed for the violation was mailbox style inconsistent with community standards and positioned incorrectly according to HOA guidelines, section 12. 4. There was a bunch of other official-sounding language, but it all boiled down to the same thing. This woman thought she had the authority to fine me for having the wrong kind of mailbox. The mailbox that came with the house, the mailbox that had been there for probably 20 years before I even moved in. But here's the thing that Darla Granger didn't know as she drove away in her self-appointed enforcement vehicle. The whole time she was swinging that hammer and making her threats. I had my phone in my hand and I recorded every single second of it from the first swing to the final threat. I caught it all on video. Mrs. Foster had been recording too, and probably Mr. Peterson as well. This lady had just committed vandalism in front of multiple witnesses, and she was so confident in her authority that she didn't even try to hide it. She had no idea that she just made the biggest mistake of her life, because I was about to find out exactly how much authority Darla Granger actually had, and something told me it was going to be a lot less than she claimed that night. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what had happened, replaying that woman's words in my head: Community Defense Force, HOA regulations, property, seizure procedures. It all sounded official, but something about the whole situation felt off. The homemade t-shirt, the crumpled paperwork, the way she seemed almost too eager to use that hammer. So I did what any reasonable person would do in the digital age. I started researching. I fired up my laptop and began with the basics Meadowbrook HOA. I typed into the search bar. A few results popped up, including what looked like an official website for the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. I clicked through and started reading about property boundaries, membership requirements, and fee structures. That's when I found the interactive map that showed exactly which properties were included in the HOA jurisdiction. I found my street, traced it with my finger on the screen, and located my house number. According to the official map, my property was clearly marked as none in bright red letters. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. My house wasn't even in the HOA. Darla Granger had just destroyed my mailbox and demanded thousands of dollars for violations that didn't apply to me. I was completely outside their authority. But that raised another question. If she wasn't supposed to be enforcing rules on my property, why was she doing it? And more importantly, was I the only one she was targeting? The next morning, I was sitting on my porch, again drinking coffee and staring at the wreckage of my mailbox, when my neighbor Maggie Foster came over. Maggie was one of those classic suburban grandmothers, the kind who baked cookies for new neighbors and always had the best gossip about what was happening on the block. She was carrying a plate of homemade muffins and wearing a concerned expression. "Clayton, honey, I saw what happened yesterday," she said, setting the muffins down on my porch table. "That woman is absolutely out of her mind. I recorded the whole thing on my phone just in case you need it for evidence." She sat down in the chair next to mine and shook her head. You know you're not. The first person she's done this to, there was an elderly gentleman who used to live in the house on the corner. Mr. Williams, sweet old man, lived there for 30 years. About 6 months ago, that same woman started showing up at his house with all kinds of violations. Grass too long, fence the wrong color, car parked in the wrong spot. She was demanding hundreds of dollars in fines every week. I leaned forward, suddenly very interested. What happened to him? Maggie's expression darkened. She wore him down. The poor man was on a fixed income, couldn't afford to fight her in court, couldn't afford to pay the fines she was demanding. She threatened to put a lien on his house if he didn't comply. Finally, he just gave up and moved in with his daughter. In Florida, sold the house for way less than it was worth, just to get away from her. This was getting worse by the minute, Maggie. How many other people has she been bothering? The older woman sighed and started counting on her fingers. I'd say she's targeted at least 8 families that I know of, probably more, everyone with the same story: fake violations, demands for immediate payment, threats of legal action. I felt my anger building again, but this time it was a cold, calculating kind of anger. This wasn't just about my mailbox anymore. Darla Granger was running some kind of scam, using fake authority to extort money from innocent people. She was targeting people who looked vulnerable, people who might not know their rights or couldn't afford to fight back. Maggie, I said, do you think any of these other families would be willing to talk to me about what happened to them? She nodded immediately. Oh, honey, they'd probably line up around the block. Everybody's been talking about it, but nobody knew what to do. We all thought she had some kind of legal authority. Most people are scared to fight the HOA, even when they're being unreasonable. That afternoon, I spent 3 hours on the phone. By the end of the day, I'd collected stories from over a dozen neighbors. Families had paid hundreds, even thousands of dollars for fake violations. Everything from toy clutter to rose bushes to car modifications to holiday decorations. The pattern was always the same. Darla would find something to complain about, demand immediate payment, and threaten legal consequences for non-compliance. Most of her targets were people who couldn't afford to fight back: elderly residents, single parents, young families. Struggling financially that evening, I sat down and made a plan. Step 1 was simple: document everything. I had my video of the mailbox incident, Maggie's recording, and now testimonies from multiple victims. Step 2 was to figure out exactly what legal authority Darla actually had, if any. Step 3 was to make sure she couldn't hurt anyone else. And step 4 was going to be the most satisfying part of all. I was going to make sure Darla Granger faced the consequences of what she'd been doing. By my calculations, she had stolen at least 15,000 from families in our neighborhood, $15,000 taken from people who were just trying to live their lives and follow the rules, people who trusted that official-sounding authority figures were telling them the truth. As I was making notes on my laptop, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mr. Dorsey, this is your 24-hour warning. Pay the fines or face property seizure, Community Defense Force. I looked at that message and smiled. Darla had no idea what she was walking into. She thought she was dealing with another scared victim who would just pay up and go away. But she was wrong. I wasn't going anywhere and I wasn't paying a single penny. I texted back, looking forward to discussing this further. See you soon, because tomorrow the real game was going to begin. The next morning, I woke up with a plan and a smile on my face. If Darla Granger wanted to play games with fake authority and intimidation tactics, I was going to play right back. But I was going to play by the actual rules, not her made-up ones. I had done my homework the night before, researching everything from property rights to harassment laws, and I was ready to have some fun. The first thing I did was go to the hardware store and buy the biggest, brightest security camera system. They had nothing fancy or hidden, just 4 obvious cameras that would record everything happening on my property in crystal clear high definition. I wanted Darla to know she was being watched. I spent the morning installing them at each corner of my house, making sure they covered every angle of my yard and the street in front of my property. Next came the fun part. I fired up my old riding mower and got to work on my lawn, but instead of just cutting the grass normally, I had something special in mind by noon. I had mowed a giant grass arrow pointing directly toward Darla's house 3 blocks away, with not HOA property spelled out in bold letters you could read from space. But I wasn't done yet. I had ordered a programmable LED sign online with overnight shipping, the kind that businesses use for advertising. As the sun went down my yard, lit up like a Christmas display with rotating messages: Partyland, no OA and fake authority zone by 18 that evening. My phone was buzzing. Non-stop neighbors were driving by to see the light show, and apparently word was spreading fast through the community. Mrs. Foster came over with her grandson, who took about 50 pictures to share with his friends, the young family. From Oak Street, stopped by to thank me for standing up to Darla. Even some people I'd never met were knocking on my door to shake my hand and tell me their own stories about her fake fines and threat around 9 p.m. just as I was settling in to enjoy the evening. I saw a familiar Honda Civic driving slowly past my house. Darla was behind the wheel, staring at my illuminated yard with an expression that could have melted steel. She drove past 3 more times in the next hour, and I could practically see the steam coming out of her ears. My security cameras were recording every pass, every angry gesture, every moment of her growing frustration. The next morning brought exactly what I expected: a visit from the police. I was sitting on my porch with my coffee when Deputy Lauren pulled up in her patrol car. She was a professional-look woman in her late 20s, and she approached my porch with the weary expression of someone who had dealt with neighborhood disputes before Mr. Dorsey. "I'm Deputy Lauren. I received a complaint about harassment and intimidation. Mind if we chat for a few minutes?" I invited her to sit down and offered her a cup of coffee, which she politely declined. "Ma'am," I said, "before we start, I want to show you something." I pulled out my phone and played the video of Darla destroying my mailbox. Then I showed her the fake fine paperwork, the HOA map, proving my property wasn't in their jurisdiction, and the testimonies I'd collected from other victims. Deputy Lauren watched and listened with growing interest, taking notes and asking detailed questions. "Mr. Dorsey," she said finally, "I have to ask about the light display and the grass arrow. The complainant says you're harassing her with your yard decorations." I couldn't help but smile. "Deputy, I'm on my own property, using my own lights and cutting my own grass. There's no law against creative landscaping or expressing myself on my own land. And technically, I'm just advertising the truth. My property isn't in the HOA, and I have the official documents to prove it." Deputy Lauren looked at my yard, then at her notes, then back at me. "You know what, Mr. Dorsey, you're absolutely right. As long as you're not violating any noise ordinances or building codes, you can decorate your property however you want. And based on what you've shown me, it sounds like..." "Miss Granger is the one who's been breaking the law." She stood up and handed me her card. "If she contacts you again or sets foot on your property without permission, call me immediately. And Mr. Dorsey, keep those cameras running." I thought that would be the end of it for the day, but Darla apparently had other plans around noon. While I was working in my garage, I heard the sound of lawnmowers outside. I walked out to find a crew of 3 guys with professional equipment mowing my entire lawn, not just trimming it, but cutting it down to basically dirt level, completely destroying my grass arrow and leaving my yard looking like a construction site. The crew chief, a guy in his 40s wearing a Meadowbrook lawn service shirt, walked up to me with a clipboard. "You Clayton Dorsey, we're here for the emergency community maintenance. That'll be $400 for the service." I stared at him in disbelief. "Who hired you to do this?" He consulted his paperwork. "Says here it was ordered by Darla Granger Community Defense Force." She said it was mandatory HOA maintenance. I pulled out my phone and started recording. "Sir, I never requested this service and I'm not paying for it. The person who hired you has no authority over my property. She's been running a scam, charging people fake fines and unauthorized services." The crew chief looked confused and a little worried. "Look, ma'am, we just got the call in the work order we don't know anything about. HOA politics, lady. Paid us in cash up front and said you'd cover the service fee." I felt bad for these guys who were clearly just trying to make an honest living and had gotten caught up in Darla's schemes, but I wasn't about to pay $400 for a service I never requested. "I'm sorry, you got dragged into this." I told them, "But you need to take this up with the person who hired you, and I'd suggest you be careful about taking work orders from her. In the future, she's not who she claims to be," after they left. I spent the afternoon documenting the lawn destruction and adding it to my growing file of evidence between the mailbox vandalism and now this unauthorized landscaping. Darla had racked up over $1.00 in property damage, not to mention the $400 she'd scammed from the lawn crew. But more importantly, she was escalating the fake authority and intimidation tactics weren't working. So now she was moving to direct sabotage that evening. As I sat on my porch looking at my devastated yard, I realized something important. Darla wasn't just running a simple scam. She was completely convinced that she had real authority, real power over this neighborhood. In her mind, she was some kind of community protector, fighting against people who refused to follow her rules that made her dangerous because people who believe their own lies are capable of almost anything. I pulled out my phone and sent a text to all the neighbors who had given me their contact information. "Emergency community meeting tomorrow night, 7:00 p.m., my house time, to put an end to." This because Darla Granger was about to learn what real community action looked like. The next morning brought an unexpected parade of fake officials. By noon, 3 different inspectors had shown up at my door, each claiming to be from some county agency, a building inspector, environmental officer, and health department representative. None could show proper ID when I asked, and all practically ran to their vehicles when I started asking for badge numbers and department contact information. My security cameras captured every awkward encounter, including clear shots of their faces and license plates. I spent the afternoon calling the real county offices to confirm what I already knew. No inspectors had been dispatched to my address. No complaints had been filed about my property. No hazardous materials, safety violations, or code enforcement issues existed. Every single official who had visited my house was a fraud, probably hired by Darla from some sketchy temp agency, or just friends doing her favors that evening. I reviewed the security camera footage from the past few days, and what I found was both disturbing and incredibly useful. The cameras had captured Darla driving past my house at least twice a day sometimes, stopping to take pictures or just sitting in her car, staring at my property. But the most interesting footage was from 2 nights ago, around 2 in the morning. The timestamp showed Darla standing in my front yard, talking animatedly into her cell. Phone the audio wasn't perfect, but I could make out enough words to understand the conversation. "Phase 2 isn't working," she was saying. "He's not backing down like the others. We need to escalate to Phase 3. There was a pause while she listened. to whoever was on the other end. Yes, I understand the risks, but he's making the whole community look weak. The defense force can't let him win. The most chilling part came next. She ended the phone call and started talking to herself, pacing back and forth across my lawn like she was giving a speech to an invisible audience. Community standards must be maintained, she muttered. Disrespect for authority cannot be tolerated. The defense force protects the neighborhood from chaos, she went on. Like this for almost 10 minutes, having a full conversation with imaginary supporters about the importance of her mission and the threats posed by people like me. Watching that footage, I realized I wasn't just dealing with a scammer anymore. Darla Granger had some serious psychological issues. She genuinely believed she was some kind of community guardian fighting a righteous battle against the forces of neighborhood destruction. In her mind, I wasn't just a guy who refused to pay fake fines. I was a dangerous rebel who threatened everything she stood for. The next day, I reached out to more neighbors and started building a complete picture of Darla's operation. The stories I heard were worse than I'd imagined. She had been systematically targeting families for almost 2 years, collecting thousands of dollars in fake fines and fees. Her method was always the same: find something she could claim was a violation, demand immediate payment, and threaten legal action if people refused to comply. The young couple on Birch Street had paid her $1,200 for unauthorized vehicle modifications because their car had tinted windows. The elderly woman on Pine had been charged $800 for inadequate lawn maintenance because she couldn't afford professional landscaping on her fixed income. The divorced father on Cedar had paid $600 to avoid child safety violations related to his kids' bicycles being visible from the street. Each victim told me the same thing. Darla was convincing, official-sounding, and absolutely relentless. She would show up with official-looking paperwork, quote specific regulation numbers, and threaten to involve lawyers or the county if people didn't pay immediately. Most of her targets were people who couldn't afford to fight back: elderly residents, single parents, young families struggling to make ends meet. She had a predator's instinct for vulnerability, but I also learned something else important. 3 families had tried to fight back over the past year, and all 3 had eventually given up and moved away, not because they were wrong, but because Darla had made their lives miserable with constant harassment, fake violations, and escalating threats. She had worn them down through sheer persistence and made them feel like fighting was more expensive than just leaving. That night, I sat down and calculated the full scope of Darla's scam. Based on the testimonies I'd collected, she had stolen at least $25 from families in our neighborhood, $25,000 taken from people who were just trying to live their lives and follow the rules. People who trusted that official-sounding authority figures were telling them the truth as I was organizing all this evidence. My phone rang. It was Mrs. Foster from next door, and she sounded worried. "Clayton, honey, I just saw Darla's car parked at the end of the street. She's been sitting there for over an hour just watching your house. I think she's planning something." I looked out my window and saw the Honda Civic under a streetlight about a block away. Even from that distance, I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat. I thanked Maggie and hung up, then settled in to watch my security monitors. If Darla wanted to escalate this situation, I was ready for her, because tomorrow night's community meeting was going to change everything. The community center had never seen anything like this. I had expected maybe 10 or 12 people to show up for the meeting. But by 7 p.m., there were 23 neighbors packed into the small conference room I'd reserved. Word had spread through the neighborhood faster than I'd imagined, and apparently Darla Granger had made enemies of a lot more people than even I realized. I'd brought 2 boxes of evidence-printed emails, photographs, video screenshots, financial records, and testimonies from 14 different families, but more importantly, I'd invited several victims to tell their stories in person. The mood in the room was tense but determined. These weren't angry vigilances looking for revenge. These were normal families who had been pushed too far by someone who had abused their trust and stolen their money. Thank you all for coming. But I started standing at the front of the room. I know this is unusual, but we have a serious problem in our neighborhood, and it's time we dealt with it together. I began by showing the video of Darla destroying my mailbox, then explained what I'd discovered about the HOA boundaries and her complete lack of authority over any of our properties. The gasps and murmurs from the audience told me that most people were hearing this information for the first time. Mrs. Patterson from Oak Street raised her hand. Are you saying that woman has no legal authority at all? I nodded. According to the official HOA documentation and county records, Darla Granger has zero authority to enforce any regulations, collect any fees, or make any demands on our properties. Everything she's been doing is fraud. That's when the floodgates opened one by one, neighbors shared similar stories. Fines for holiday lights, driveway surfaces, car colors, lawn decorations. Each more absurd than the last, the pattern was always the same. Official-sounding paperwork, immediate payment demands and threats of legal action. Most victims had paid rather than fight, thinking they were dealing with legitimate authority, but the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. An elderly man named Frank Roberts slowly stood up in the back of the room. I didn't recognize him at first, but Mrs. Foster whispered that he was Mr. Williams' brother-in-law, the man who had been forced to sell his house and move to Florida. My family asked me to come tonight, he said, in a shaky but determined voice. They wanted me to tell you what that woman did to Harold. Frank explained how Darla had targeted his brother-in-law with increasingly aggressive harassment over a period of 6 months. Harold was 82 years old, living on Social Security, and that woman made his life hell. She demanded thousands of dollars in fines for things like having the wrong color mailbox or parking his car 6 in too far to the left. When he couldn't pay, she threatened to put a lien on his house. She told him she'd have him arrested for violating community standards. The room was silent, except for the sound of people quietly crying. Frank continued, Harold was so scared and confused that he stopped leaving his house. He thought he was going to jail over the color of his mailbox. Finally, he just gave up and sold the house for half what it was worth. Just to get away from her, he died 6 weeks later in Florida, still worried that somehow she was going to find him and demand more money. That story changed the entire energy in the room. This wasn't just about money anymore. Darla Granger had terrorized an elderly man so severely that he had abandoned his home of 30 years and died in exile, afraid and confused. She had literally scared someone to death with her fake authority and relentless harassment. I stood up again and pulled out the real bombshell information I'd been saving. There's something else you all need to know, I said. Opening my laptop, I contacted the actual Meadowbrook HOA board yesterday. Turns out Darla Granger used to be a member of their board of directors. She was removed from her position over a year ago for financial irregularities and harassment complaints. She's been running this fake enforcement operation completely on her own, with no authority from anyone. The murmurs in the room grew louder. People were getting angry, and rightfully so, but I needed to channel that anger into something constructive. Here's what we're going to do, I announced. First, we're going to document every fake fine, every fraudulent fee, and every illegal threat that woman has made. Second, we're going to contact the real authorities, the police, the District Attorney's Office, and the State Fraud Investigation Unit. And third, we're going to make sure she can't do this to anyone else ever again. The meeting continued for another hour as we organized our evidence and planned our next steps. People exchanged phone numbers and email addresses, creating a neighborhood network that had never existed before. We assigned tasks. Some people would contact other victims, others would research legal options, and a few volunteers would help document and organize all the evidence we'd collected as the meeting was wrapping up. Mrs. Foster came up to me with a worried expression. Clayton, I hate to tell you this, but I saw Darla drive past the community center 3 times during our meeting. I think she knows we're all here. I thanked her for the information. But honestly, I wasn't surprised Darla had been escalating her surveillance and harassment for days. It was only a matter of time before she made another move. We were just packing up our materials when the double doors of the conference room burst open. Darla Granger stormed in wearing her homemade Community Defense Force shirt, and carrying her ever-present clipboard behind her were 2 guys I didn't recognize, both wearing matching shirts that said HOA enforcement. The entire room went silent. This illegal gathering is in violation of community standards. She announced, her voice echoing off the walls. All participants are subject to immediate fines for conspiracy to undermine neighborhood authority. She started reading from her clipboard, listing off violations like unauthorized assembly, community disruption, and resistance to lawful authority. But something was different this time. Instead of the usual fear and confusion her presence normally created, I heard something else in the room. Quiet at first, then building. As more people realized how ridiculous this woman sounded, she was standing in front of 23 people who now knew exactly who she was and what she'd been doing, trying to intimidate them with the same fake authority that had worked for so long. Tom Wilson stood up, "First Lady, we know you're a fraud, we know you have no authority, and we know you're going to jail one by one." Other people stood up, creating a wall of unified resistance that Darla had never faced before. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked uncertain, maybe even scared. That's when Deputy Lauren walked through the doors behind Darla's fake enforcement team. Deputy Lauren's timing couldn't have been more perfect. She surveyed the scene. Darla and her 2 fake enforcement officers facing off against 23 angry neighbors, and immediately took control of the situation. "M. Granger," she said in a calm but authoritative voice, "I'm going to need you and your associates to step outside with me now." Darla's fake confidence crumbled instantly. "Officer, these people are in violation of community assembly regulations. I was just enforcing neighborhood standards." Deputy Lauren shook her head. "Ma'am, you need to come with me immediately, and gentlemen," she said to the 2 fake enforcement officers. "Unless you want to be charged as accessories, I suggest you distance yourselves." From this situation right now, the 2 guys in matching shirts looked at each other, then at Darla, then practically ran for the exit. Apparently whatever she was paying them wasn't worth getting arrested over. Darla herself tried to maintain her authority facade for another few seconds, but when Deputy Lauren put her hand on her handcuffs, the fight went out of her completely. Darla was released on her own recognizance the next morning, which meant she was back in the neighborhood by noon. But instead of lying low and hoping the situation would blow over, she doubled down on her delusions of authority in the most spectacular way possible. She set up what she called a press conference in her front yard, complete with a folding table, a hand-painted banner that read justice for community defense, and a stack of papers that she claimed were evidence of harassment. The local newspaper actually sent someone to cover it, probably thinking it would be a harmless human interest story about neighborhood disputes, but what they got instead was a front-row seat to a complete mental breakdown disguised as a political rally. Darla stood behind her folding table in her homemade HOA shirt, reading from a prepared statement about systematic attacks on community leadership and criminal conspiracy to undermine neighborhood safety. She accused me of weaponizing my lawn with LED signs and claimed I was running surveillance harassment operations. Her speech was a bizarre rant about intimidation, displays, and illegal mob formation that made little sense to anyone listening. Most ridiculous of all, she presented what she called evidence of my threatening behavior, a video that was so obviously edited and manipulated that even the newspaper reporter looked skeptical. The fake video showed clips of me talking to neighbors, but the audio had been replaced with completely different conversations that made it sound like I was threatening people and organizing some kind of anti-Ho rebellion. It was amateur hour editing, the kind of thing a high school student could debunk in 5 minutes, but Darla presented it like it was smoking gun evidence of criminal activity. But here's where her plan backfired spectacularly. While she was holding her fake press conference, several of my neighbors were live streaming the entire thing and providing real-time commentary about her lies and manipulations. Mrs. Chen was posting fact checks after every false claim Tom Wilson was sharing, documents that disproved her statements. Even Mrs. Foster was recording everything and sharing it with her church group. The newspaper article that came out the next day was not what Darla was expecting. Instead of a sympathetic piece about a beleaguered community leader fighting against neighborhood bullies, the reporter had done actual journalism. They'd contacted the real HOA board, verified that Darla had no authority, and interviewed several of her victims. The headline read, "Local woman accused of operating fake HOA enforcement scam." That's when things got really ugly. The newspaper article was picked up by other media outlets, and suddenly our little neighborhood dispute was getting attention. From across the state, a local TV station sent a crew to interview some of Darla's victims, and their story was even more damaging. They showed footage of my destroyed mailbox, interviewed Frank Roberts about his brother-in-law's tragic story, and presented clear evidence of Darla's fraudulent activity. Darla's response to this negative coverage was to escalate her fake authority claims even further. She started calling herself Chief of Community Defense and claimed that the media attention proved there was a conspiracy against legitimate neighborhood governance. She hired what she called a legal advocate, actually just a guy who helped people fill out small claims, court paperwork, and announced that she was filing defamation lawsuits against everyone who had spoken out against her for about 48 hours. I have to admit I was worried. The threat of lawsuits, even frivolous ones, can be scary and expensive to defend against. The fake video evidence was obviously manipulated, but proving that in court might require hiring experts and spending thousands of dollars. Some of my neighbors started having second thoughts about pursuing the case, worried that Darla might somehow find a way to make their lives even more miserable. That Friday morning, I was seriously considering just moving away from the whole situation. I was sitting on my porch, drinking coffee and staring at my rebuilt mailbox, wondering if fighting Darla was worth the stress and expense it was causing. The media attention had died down, but she was still in the neighborhood, still claiming authority and still threatening legal action against anyone who opposed her. I had actually pulled out my phone to call a real estate agent when I got a text message that changed everything. It was from Deputy Lauren, and it contained just 5 words: "Don't do anything. Meet me now." She included an address for a coffee shop about 10 minutes away and said to come alone. 30 minutes later, I was sitting across from Deputy Lauren in a corner booth, watching her review a thick folder of documents. With a smile on her face, "Mr. Dorsey," she said, looking up from her paperwork, "I have something that's going to end this situation once and for all, and you're going to love how we caught her." The screenshots Deputy Lauren showed me were even more damning than I'd initially realized. My security cameras, which I'd positioned to monitor my own property, had inadvertently captured Darla's garage through her open door, and what they'd recorded was a masterclass in fraud and self-incrimination. Take 2, Darla could be heard saying in the footage, "Clayton Dorsey threatened me with farm equipment and said he would destroy community standards." She paused, shook her head, and started again. "No, that sounds fake. Take 3, Mr. Dorsey has been systematically harassing me and undermining my authority as community defense chief." Another pause. GH, that's not believable either. Take 4, Deputy. Lauren had 8 hours of this footage showing Darla creating fake evidence, practicing fake testimony, and coaching herself on how to lie. More convincingly, she'd filmed herself from multiple angles, created fake threatening voicemails by playing recordings, and pretending to react to them, and even staged fake property damage in her own yard to blame on me. But here's the best part. Deputy Lauren said, "Pulling out another set of documents we've been investigating, Miss Granger, for 3 months. Turns out your neighborhood isn't the first place she's tried this scam. She did the same thing in Riverside County 2 years ago, collected over $30,000 in fake fines before the authorities caught up with her. And before that, she ran a similar operation in Orange County. This was bigger than I'd imagined. Darla wasn't just a neighborhood nuisance with delusions of authority. She was a serial scammer who moved from community to community, setting up fake HOA enforcement operations and stealing money from families who didn't know their rights. She'd probably been perfecting this con for years, learning from each community how to be more convincing and more intimidating to what happens now." I asked Deputy Lawrence, smiled, and started packing up her evidence folder. Now Miss Granger gets arrested on multiple felony charges: fraud, extortion, harassment filing, false police reports, and about 6 other charges I can't even pronounce. She's looking at serious prison time. And more importantly, she's going to have to pay back every penny she stole from your neighbors. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of sirens. Not the panicked kind of sirens that mean something terrible has happened, but the satisfied kind that mean justice is being served. I looked out my window to see 3 police cars parked in front of Darla's house and officers walking her to a patrol car in handcuffs. She was no longer wearing her homemade community defense suit shirt. Instead, she was in an orange jumpsuit that said County Jail across the back. The local news coverage that followed was everything I could have hoped for. The same reporter who had written the original exposé returned to cover Darla's arrest, and this time he had access to all. The evidence that Deputy Lauren's investigation had uncovered the story revealed the full scope of her multi-county scam operation and included interviews with victims from 3 different communities. But the most satisfying part of the coverage was the segment about community response and recovery. The news crew filmed our neighborhood organizing a fraud victim support network to help people recover their stolen money and learn about their legal rights. They interviewed Frank Roberts, who had driven up from Florida to see justice done for his brother-in-law. They showed footage of neighbors helping each other file police reports and insurance claims. The real Meadowbrook HOA board issued an official statement apologizing for not catching Darla's fraud sooner and announcing new policies to prevent similar scams in the future. They offered to help all of her victims recover their money and provided free legal consultations for anyone who wanted to pursue civil lawsuits against her. 3 weeks later, our neighborhood organized something unprecedented, a community celebration that doubled as a mailbox. Replacement ceremony. The HOA board, feeling guilty about Darla's actions and grateful for how our community had handled the situation, offered to replace every piece of property that had been damaged during her fake enforcement campaign. They went above and beyond, installing beautiful new mailboxes for everyone on my street, complete with standardized designs that actually met real HOA guidelines. But my mailbox was special. The community had voted to give me the biggest, most official-looking mailbox they could find, with a plaque that read, "Clayton Dorsey Community Hero 2024. The ceremony itself was perfect. About 40 neighbors showed up, including several families from other streets who had heard about our victory over Darla. Mrs. Foster had organized a potluck dinner. Tom Wilson had set up a sound system, and even some of the kids from the neighborhood had made signs, thanking me for stopping the mean lady as I cut the red ribbon to officially open my new mailbox. I looked around at all these people who had come together to fight against fraud and intimidation. 6 months ago, most of us barely knew each other's names. Darla's scam had isolated us, made us afraid to talk to our neighbors about what was happening. But fighting back against her had created something stronger, a real community built on mutual support and shared values. The local newspaper photographer was there to capture the ribbon cutting, and that photo ended up on the front page of the community section. The caption read, "Neighborhood celebrates victory over fraud scam." In the background of the photo, you could see my grass arrow, which I decided to maintain as a permanent reminder of what we'd accomplished together. A few weeks after the ceremony, I got word that Darla's moving truck had been spotted loading up her belongings. Apparently her house was being sold to cover legal fees and victim restitution payments. As the truck pulled away from her former house, Mrs. Foster came over to my porch with 2 cups of coffee and a satisfied smile. She said, settling into the chair next to mine. "I heard from my cousin in Arizona that there's been some kind of HOA enforcement scam starting up in her neighborhood. Woman in her 30s claiming to be from something called Community Defense Force." We looked at each other and started laughing. Good luck to them. 6 months later, my security cameras are still running. My LED sign still lights up the yard every evening, and my mailbox remains the most official-looking one on the street. But more importantly, our neighborhood has stayed connected. We have monthly community meetings now, not to fight against fraud, but to plan block parties and organize volunteer projects. We know each other's names, look out for each other's kids, and most importantly, we know how to stand together when someone tries to take advantage of us. Sometimes the internet and the truth make a perfect team. Sometimes standing up to bullies creates something better than just defeating them. Sometimes the best revenge is building a community so strong that scammers and fraudsters can't get a foothold in the first place. And sometimes justice really is served with a side of neighborhood solidarity.